We have an incredible guest this week, which I know there's been a lot of talk in the community about the book Hannah's Children. And I am so blessed to have the author of that book that we've all been absolutely adoring here with us tonight. If you have yet to get a chance to read the book, I highly recommend you check out the link below in the description right after this episode, because let me tell you, even though your girl's not like the greatest at math, she's not necessarily an econ major, it was my top 3 favorite book that has come out this year. Absolutely incredible. It's a must read regardless of any other mitigating circumstance or factor in your life. Whether you're a parent, whether you want to become one, regardless, check it out. Brilliant book. Incredible audiobook as well. Love it. So we are here. Oh, thank you guys so much in chat. We are here with Catherine Ruth Pakaluk. Catherine, thank you for joining us.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here. Been looking forward to it.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you're here. So what were your first memories of religion?
Wow, my first memories, it goes way back. So I was raised by my mom is a really devout lady, and she's from Iowa,
Mm-hmm.
and from a German farming community. And
Cool.
so my earliest memories of religion are really going to church with my mom. I mean, we went as a family. I don't mean to take my
Mm-hmm.
dad out of the picture, but my mom talked a lot about faith at home. And maybe an early memory, if it's okay to
Yeah,
share it with you, is
absolutely.
this conversation we had. And I think it's partially a memory, but partially I remember it because she talked about it a lot. And I must have been like 4 or 5 years old, and we were
Mm-hmm.
having this conversation about Jesus is in your heart, and
Mm-hmm.
Jesus wants to live in your heart. And around that time, a friend of ours had a baby with a Down syndrome, and my mom was explaining to me that this baby had a hole in her heart.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, and then I basically said, well, is the hole there so that Jesus can see out? So,
Oh,
it's like but I've never forgotten it, because it was something that
yeah.
was like, of course my mom was like, oh, but I more bring that up,
Mm-hmm.
not so much as a memory of religion, but as like a memory of the kind of conversations that were profound in my house growing up.
Mm-hmm.
Something that's influenced me a lot, like that, just the normal, natural way that my mom talked about Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a really so normal that you might, as a kid, be like, oh, so yeah, Jesus would be looking for a way to look out of your
Yeah,
heart. So I
makes
thought it was
perfect
really
sense.
special because, of course, we talked about children with disabilities as being very special and really
Mhm.
specially loved by God. So it just made a lot of sense to me. I was like, well, obviously, like, that must be what's going on.
That is so
Yeah.
precious.
So I have a lot of memories of going to church with my folks when I was little, but that just tells you like what my family was like a little
Yeah,
bit. Yeah.
absolutely. I remember when I was itty bitty, it just came up the other day in conversation. We had gone to a big service where there was like a bunch of baptisms. Then
Hmm.
I had come home. I was about like 6 years old. And we had like one of those like big jacuzzi tubs with all the jets.
Oh, that's great.
And so I like dunked myself. I was like,
Hmm.
and they're like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I baptized myself, duh."
Perfectly normal.
um,
Yeah. Yeah. Perfectly
so
normal.
I
Yeah.
totally feel you there.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Now,
that was
mhm.
great. That was a great childhood memory. Yeah.
So as you know, you went on in your relationship with Jesus. What led you to choose Maria Goretti as your confirmation saint?
Oh, um, great question. Man, you did your research. I'm like, wow. Oh yeah, I wrote about that. um, you know, um, I probably have to bring my mom into that one too,
Mhm.
which is interesting. I think my mom kind of proposed her to me. I didn't know a lot about her um, as a as a girl growing up. I mean, so I was confirmed. I was about I think a freshman in high school,
Mhm.
and I would say I didn't know a lot about Maria Goretti before that. My mom kind of brought it up, and I think the well, I think a lot of young Catholics these days, I mean, what I
Mhm.
advise my own kids is like to pick saints that you maybe want to be like, or that, inspire you. Those are kind of
Yeah.
common things. But if you had asked me at the time, like, if was she somebody I wanted to be like, I mean, I certainly would have said I thought she was inspiring. But I think maybe if I were to hazard a guess, but my mom,
Mhm.
my mom was thinking, I mean, we were really pro-life. We grew up really pro-life. And then I think as a young Christian,
Mhm.
you can get a little bit oppressed by the way in which the culture sort of pushes against not just life, right? But
Yeah.
we recognize it's all tied up with this culture of like we'll just say pornography and
Mhm. Absolutely.
promiscuity, right? And just
Absolutely.
immodesty, right? Like it's all together.
Yeah.
And to even just say the word modesty. And so I think what my mom was thinking was,
Mhm.
well, Saint Maria Goretti is somebody who really is a testimony to kind of the value of Christian purity in the
Mhm.
face of a culture that where these these virtues of modesty and Christian purity are meant actually to prevent us from getting to a place
Yeah.
where life is so disposable, right? Where people are
Absolutely.
in such a tragic position with their babies that they would think that death would be the only way out.
Yeah.
And so I think my mom was thinking of me as a young pro-life Christian and thinking like
Mhm.
maybe she'd be a great role model and even just someone to pray to try to create and help promote a culture of not just respect for life, but of
Mhm.
Christian purity. And of course, I mean, her model of forgiveness is also,
Yeah.
I think, really, really deep and important for a culture that's been really super wounded by various types of sexual sins. And I don't think I
Absolutely.
appreciated that part of her story when I was that
Mhm.
age, because I think when you're that age, you're just thinking of, kind of the, I don't know, when you're 14, you think you could just grow up and like do the right things and save the world.
Exactly.
Right?
Like,
And then
what
yeah,
makes it so
exactly.
hard? Like, it's
Right. It's just
obviously
gonna be easy
this.
to save the world,
Yeah.
right? And as you get older, you realize actually, like Jesus saved the world. You're not gonna save the world by believing the right things or doing the right
Exactly.
things. And you start to kind of realize these deeper and right, it's much more important to meditate on mercy and forgiveness and like how
Mhm.
so as I got older, I think I've appreciated more kind of the fullness of her role, what she can offer us in our
Yeah.
current like really super wounded culture. Yeah.
That's really beautiful.
Yeah.
I
I
love
bring that
that.
up in part because I think um I didn't know any of this when I was that age. I
Mhm.
think Maria Goretti, I don't know if your audience knows much about her. But certainly in the Catholic community,
Mhm.
every time she comes up, there's a bit of a like. There's always a bit of a maybe a divisiveness about it.
Mhm.
People argue like, well, should we hold her up as a model because she did try to resist being raped, right?
Mhm.
And so the concern is that you're maybe promoting something that could put people in danger in different ways, or even shaming
Mhm.
people who can't resist or weren't able or were overcome in spite of their and so that conversation is difficult to have, but the
Mhm.
church has always maintained actually the thing that the church wants to promote is like her forgiveness after like so I just
Yeah.
bring up her forgiveness as something I've learned to appreciate more as an adult, and I didn't know very much about at the time, because I think, like I said, I just
Mhm.
saving the world, something I really realized was like a ridiculous goal. But I think when you're young, that's what you
Yeah.
think you're going to do, right? You're going to
Absolutely.
fight all the dragons and slay all the demons. And anyway, so
Exactly. And
yeah,
it's so good to know that, Jesus did this for us so that we
yeah,
don't have to, but that still
right,
doesn't,
right,
preclude us
right,
from being able to
yeah,
set up strong foundations that lead to strong communities.
right, right, exactly. Yeah. So, and I'm sure she's been, yeah, I'm sure she's interceded for me in different ways, and I'm
Mhm.
grateful for that. And so,
So, moving on to kind of like the current daily practices,
yeah.
are there any that you find essential for maintaining and nurturing your faith?
In my daily faith practices, for sure.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, yeah. Um, yes. So let me think about it. Where I want to start. um, so I would say, I think over the years, like right.
Mhm.
So I would almost like to draw a line. Like when I was a young mom, it's
Mhm.
like so like okay, I'm not an old mom yet, but I mean I'm not a super young mom. We'll just say that, right?
Mhm.
Um, when your children are little, I got married and we were blessed with children like so immediately, I didn't have time
Mhm.
to like even think twice. Um, and that was a great blessing. But at the time, it was like, right
Yeah.
away when I was married, I was like sick to my stomach, and
Hmm.
like there were all these things that I didn't learn how to do, and
Yeah.
even like habits of prayer that I think when I look back, sometimes when I talk to young women, I'm like, oh, before you have children, here's like 10 things that would be great to learn. But I didn't know I should be trying to learn. So
Hmm.
then when I was married with little babies, I was like trying to learn how to be a mom to little babies. And also like, oh, but how do I learn how to pray too? Right.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I want to sort of make sure your listeners know so they're not overwhelmed, depending on whatever stage of life they're at,
Hmm.
that the things I'm about to tell you about are really things that I've been able to learn to build into my life later as my kids got older. It took a long time.
Yeah.
But yeah, so for sure, like morning prayer, when I had babies was like harder to do it.
Hmm.
But yeah, just taking that time, like 15 or 20 minutes just in the morning, sometimes just starting with some scripture, but usually just try to close my eyes and just try to have a conversation with Jesus. Um, and it looks different every day, but I try to go through different parts of that, like,
Hmm.
you know, um, just recalling to mind his presence. Like I'm not just here myself creating my day, like, right? So that's
Hmm.
just me, my day, like the presence of God. And then thinking about, okay, well, I want to draw near to God. Well, the next thing to do is to ask forgiveness. Like I'm drawing near to God, but of course I'm aware of my sin. But then,
Hmm.
of course, I'm aware that He's forgiving me and He's forgiven me. So then that gratitude, right? So kind of
Hmm.
working through these things every day that starts the day. And then the gratitude for the forgiveness, right? And then you
Hmm.
realize, okay, well, He wants to be with me, is intimate. And then kind of making space, like after settling into that time, making space to listen. Like, what is it that God wants to tell me today? And then, somewhere in that mix, there's that list of intentions, like all those people that I have this list, so it's like
Hmm.
there's people
Yeah.
like my husband, right? He's top of the list. Like, well, actually, you know what? This is going to sound funny. Sometimes, some saints I've read, like they say,
Hmm.
it's like when you're on an airplane, and they say when the oxygen masks come down, put the mask on
Hmm.
yourself first. So some saints are like, no, no, you have to pray for yourself first because
Hmm.
actually, like, you have to be, yeah, that's like the first thing you have to do is pray, for all the graces that you need. So sometimes I pray
Hmm.
for myself first. So then immediately next is for my husband. I think that's my duty to pray for him
Hmm.
first, pray for his work, for his intentions, and then my children. Oh, and then my godchildren, and
Hmm.
then my grandchildren, and then my students because they feel like my children. And then you just kind of
Yeah.
I work out from there, right? The whole
Hmm.
list. And then it's the people I remember who ask for my prayers.
Hmm.
And then you're like, oh, what about all the people who asked my prayers? I don't remember what I was praying for. So that's a huge,
I'm
like,
so guilty of
right?
that.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, I figure if every day, if you ask God to
Hmm.
bless the people who asked for your prayers, you're like, okay, and for all the people who asked my prayers, then it's like you're not being dishonest. You are praying for them.
Hmm.
But and some of them you remember, because you have like a friend with cancer or you have
Yeah.
like somebody specific, and those people you remember. Anyway,
Hmm.
those are all the things I try to work through in my morning prayer.
Hmm.
And that, like I said, it's taken me a lot of years to try to build that habit. But yeah, I feel like something's missing in the day if I don't start that way. But other things, I try to make it to a Catholic mass if I can in the day, and
Hmm.
sometimes I can, and sometimes I can't. And on daily, like Sunday masses are usually like an hour. I don't know if that's pretty similar in your
Hmm.
church, but the daily masses are usually a lot shorter, so they might be like
Yeah.
20 to 30 minutes, depending on how long the priest talks. So if I can get to that, I try to. And then last but not, well, like there's night prayer, kind of
Hmm.
reviewing the day. Sometimes my husband and I do that together. We try
Hmm.
sometimes to do that together. And then the last thing probably is uh, what I'm a big walker. I like to walk every day a little bit, be in nature. So
Hmm.
I try to pray on my walks a little bit. And sometimes I
That's
listen to
awesome.
podcasts, but I mix it up a little.
Yeah.
But I try to include in my walk, usually rosary if I can. But and other
Hmm.
times I might just like maybe bring up in prayer things that are troubles during the day or some things that I'm like thinking about or working on.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are kind of the main things. And then I usually keep a few religious books around that,
Hmm.
peak for 5 or 10 minutes. So
Is there a particular one that you're reading now that you've been enjoying lately?
mm. So one that I've been really okay, so two. I'll mention two.
Hmm.
So with the Cabrini movie that came out
Hmm.
this spring, I still haven't had a chance to see it.
I haven't either.
Yeah, but I would like to.
Same.
And so I actually have a colleague at work whose name is Cabrini. Her
Oh,
mom named her
cool.
after, and I've never met a Cabrini before. Her first name is Cabrini, and so I asked her to borrow a biography because I thought,
Hmm.
well, it's one thing to um, go to the movie, but I thought
Hmm.
like I don't know, it's always good to find out something and just get the real storyline. So I borrowed
Yeah.
a biography of Mother Cabrini from my friend at work. So I'm excited about that one. And but the one that I read last year, it took a whole year, like 5 minutes
Hmm.
a day, which really blew my mind as a diary of a Polish nun, Saint Faustina. I don't know if you've heard of her.
I haven't.
She was a Polish nun, and she died pretty young. I
Hmm.
I think from tuberculosis or something. She is the saint of divine mercy. So, and I was mentioning earlier mercy and
Yeah.
forgiveness, and her whole like mission was to talk and write about mercy.
Hmm.
And so she had an inspiration to have a picture painted of Jesus kind of like spilling out his mercy to the world.
Hmm.
And so she has a whole diary of her conversations with Jesus. And it's so beautiful. So, anyway,
That's
it took me
incredible.
like, and why did I read it? You might be like, well, where did that come from? So, there's a little house of
Hmm.
religious nuns that are in her same religious order that moved into my neighborhood.
Oh, cool.
I know. So I had picked up her diary few like a couple decades ago and never really like
Hmm.
read the whole thing cover to cover. And so these nuns moved in and they're just so lovely. And so they were recommending it and I thought, well, okay, you know what? If it's like if the nuns move into your neighborhood and they say like, "Hey, have you read it?" or they're recommending it to you, I thought you kind of it's almost like do you need a sign from God? You should maybe like finally read the book.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I'm very devoted fan of Pope John Paul II.
Hmm.
Um, and he was Polish. So this Saint Faustina had a big influence on him. So she was alive
Oh,
in the
cool.
1930s. That she's not that
Hmm.
old. I don't know. I think she died right at the beginning of the Second World War. So she lived
Hmm.
through the First World War, and then anyway. So her diary is something I finished reading last year, and I just loved it. Yeah, really loved it.
That's incredible.
Yeah,
Yeah, I grew up with a family that was really big fans of that specific Pope. I think my grandfather actually met him when he came
yeah,
to New England.
amazing, amazing. It was like he bilocated or something. He went to so many places.
Yeah.
And he was definitely the Pope of my childhood, right? So,
Hmm.
like as a little kid, a little Catholic, that was like, and he was. So now I show my students often videos of like his
Hmm.
speeches and where he went on travels, and it's amazing that I forget that they don't remember what he was like because the
Yeah.
last few years of his life he was super sick, and
Hmm.
but yeah, he's very special. But anyway, that Poland connection was really important for him
Yeah.
and for that saint. So anyway, she's really kind of very cool, interesting person. Uh, so I recommend it for anybody that's really feeling drawn to meditate more on God's mercy um, and forgiveness. I just think she's really a saint for our times. Yeah.
That's incredible. Producer, please write that down so I can read that later. Thank you. um, but
Yeah.
yeah, everybody, some people in the chat are like, "Ooh, I want to read that. That sounds like a great
Yeah.
book."
Yeah, it's wonderful. Who doesn't love a diary, right?
Yeah.
Right? So, it's so easy to read because it's just her diary, and she just writes about her prayers and her conversations with Jesus. Yeah,
That's incredible. So you mentioned that you sometimes do night prayers with your husband. Are there
yeah,
any other things that you guys do together that help strengthen your relationship spiritually?
yeah. I'm really blessed to have a husband who puts spiritual things first.
Hmm.
And so I just want to say that right up front. I think that I want to give him credit for almost all of the spiritual good things in our relationship.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, he's the one who I think when we were first, well, I'll say this. When we were first married, we're 18 years apart. So let me get that right out there.
Hmm.
There's a big age difference between us. So I was a younger person when we got married, and I was
Hmm.
closer to so we're both sort of convert/reverts to
Okay.
Catholicism. We were both baptized Catholic, and I grew
Hmm.
up practicing my faith most of the way through to college, and then kind of had some rocky times in college, like a lot of
Hmm.
people do.
Yeah.
And I didn't like, I never sort of walked away from my faith, but I stopped practicing it well. And
Hmm.
then I started to doubt whether I should stay Catholic or Christian. And I
Hmm.
had a lot of teachers in my secular college that were, let's just say, like, not just atheists, but like pretty militantly atheist. And
Yeah.
I realized I didn't really have answers to a lot of those questions. I didn't think it was right, but I didn't really have answers. And so we can talk about it later. But and then I had a kind of conversion, or like a reversion, where
Hmm.
a spiritual grace, I would say. When I met my husband and we started dating, and then we got engaged quickly. He was, that was just a couple years after my sort of spiritual awakening, or
Hmm.
yeah. But for him, that was about 20 years after his own conversion. So he was just further down the road. One of the reasons we
Yeah.
connected and really felt drawn to each other was our mutual experience of deepening of faith and conversion like that,
Hmm.
out of coming out of a very secular space. So one of the things I was drawn to when we started seeing each other was his spiritual maturity. And I thought, like, well, I'd really like to be married to somebody who puts first things first. So that's why I definitely want to give
Absolutely.
him credit there.
That's
Because
such
when
a
I
green
was,
flag.
yeah, because when I was such a young wife and a young mom, when you're young in your maturity, both
Hmm.
spiritual and human maturity, right?
Hmm.
You What does it mean to be like less mature? Well, part of the symptom of that is that you don't always do what you think you should do. So
Yeah.
you're like, right, so you're like, well, I'd really like to pray every day, but you are like, oh, well, I'm not feeling in the mood today.
Hmm.
So my husband was really a rock, and kind of much more steady at that point. And but the only thing I could take credit for is like seeing that was good and being like,
Hmm.
that's what I want to hook myself onto, right? Like if I'm going to
Yeah.
be yoked into somebody here, I want to be yoked into somebody that is on that train, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
So during that
yeah.
time, if you don't mind me
No,
asking,
sure,
just from like a very personal level, did you ever
sure.
notice that like during that time it kind of felt more like your husband trusted God more than maybe you trusted him, and how
Oh
did
yeah,
you get there?
yeah,
Because
yeah,
I admire my husband's faith so much, but sometimes it just feels like he trusts God more than I do, and I'm like,
yeah. Right, right, right.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple things I think that uh, one is, you just like, you're always glad that you're glad that you trusted later,
Hmm.
right? Or like
Yeah.
you see like, okay, well, I do want to pray, but in the moment, like maybe it didn't seem like the best thing to do or the right thing. And so then you think, oh, okay, I'm glad after the fact. So there was a part of it was just this learning, like, well, if I'm resisting it a little bit at the moment, it's going to feel fine
Hmm.
later. I'm going to be glad later. So I think that was a piece of it. Was coming, and then the other piece of it, I think, was I saw how much my husband's trust in God was. Maybe this will sound strange, but how much his trust in God was bound up with his faithfulness.
Hmm.
And at that time in my life, I was really impressed with what seemed to me like a male um, virtue, like something that's really
Hmm.
male, which is just this like rock solid fit. There's no time in my life I feel like my husband's ever strayed or looked anywhere else. Like he's had an eye for me always.
Yeah.
Like, and I saw early on how much his trust in God and his faith was connected also to like the quality of our relationship. And
Hmm.
early on, I saw that is a special kind of virtue, and it's
Yes.
really masculine and really attractive.
Yes. Absolutely.
And so, like, although I could see that it was a virtue, it wasn't something I had in the same
Hmm.
amount or quality. But I just thought, well, you know, there aren't that many things that are reliable in this world, right? And we want
Yeah.
we want God's we want God, like God is faithful, right? Like I think this
Yes.
is why it's a special male virtue. God is
Mhm.
faithful, but we are always doubting that. And so it's like, here we are praying for some sign. We're always like, well, God, like, I don't trust you all the way. Like, make it
Yeah.
so obvious. And then you've got this husband in your life who is just Mr. Solid. And so at some
Yes.
point you're like, okay, well, how would I be praying for a sign that God is faithful, but I've got this husband who's super faithful. Like, so I started to see that
Mhm.
actually, as much as that his fidelity and his trust in God was linked together with his being such a great husband. And so I'm not saying that
That
I
makes a lot of
ever
sense.
became that person myself. I mean, of
Mhm.
course, I think my faith has grown, but that I learned to trust it because I there were to me at that time in my life, what I was really drawn to was just that out of my family of origin wasn't that
Mhm.
happy, and I saw the people around me were so searching and so unhappy, and I
Mhm.
thought, well, I just was going to cling on to this rock. It was like a rock of stability,
Yeah.
and that was, I thought that could be healing, healing and
Mhm.
attractive. So yeah,
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much. I
yeah,
really genuinely appreciate that.
yeah.
How did you meet your husband?
So that's it's like, do you want the full story or do you want the half story? But I kind of
Whatever
feel like you
you
want
like,
the
share
full
with us.
story. It's
Yes.
literally sort of like, okay, because this is a faith audience, and so the full story is a faith story. But it is a sort of a shocking story. Um, so um, my husband, I mentioned already, your
Mhm.
listeners know that where there's an age difference between us.
Mhm.
My husband was married to his first wife for almost 20 years, and she got diagnosed with breast cancer. Let me think, between her fifth and her sixth children. And so she was 32, 33, I think 33 maybe,
Mhm.
when she got diagnosed with breast cancer, and it was after her fifth baby. And
Mhm.
anyway, the end of it is that she fought it, and but it came back after a ways, and then
Mhm.
um, let's see, towards the end of her 30s, it was metastatic, and so she
Oof.
miraculously, after her her first round of treatment,
Mhm.
miraculously had a sixth baby.
Wow.
And she prayed that she would at least live to see her first baby into kindergarten. And I think she
Mhm.
passed away 3 weeks after Sophie went to kindergarten. I know, like, it's like really
Yeah.
amazing. The end of September, of that baby's first year in kindergarten.
Mhm.
And so um, I had met her and her family briefly. I'd met them through pro-life activities, and in college I'd been involved in pro-life, although I was drifting away from my faith a little bit, but I was like
Yeah.
always very clear that life mattered. and
Mhm.
and so okay, so they knew who I was and I knew who they were, but I didn't know them very well. And towards the end of her life that summer, she said, look, I think you should maybe consider getting married again for the sake of the girls, because they had three boys and three girls, and the girls were
Mhm.
little.
Yeah.
And she said to him, like, you should think about it. And he said, well, no, like, there's only you. And
Mhm.
and then she said, look, I think you and Catherine would get along, and you should consider looking her up. And he just thought she was crazy,
Yeah.
and just put it aside. And she passed, and some months went by, and the girls were little. They were like 5 and 7 and 9, I
Mhm.
think, at that time. And if you've known little girls, they
Yes.
they were like, well, come on, Dad, like, aren't you going to get married again? So
Mhm.
at some point he thought, well, maybe I'll just look her up, and well, we'll have lunch if she'll say yes to having lunch, and I'll just sort of
Mhm.
see what she's like. And
Yeah.
maybe it's not for me, but at least I can check the box.
Mhm.
And I can pray to God and say, like, well, I tried that and that didn't really work out. So he reached out, and I was too busy, and I said no. And then I was too busy again. I said no. And so like 6 months went by, and
Mhm.
and and I thought, okay, I mean, yeah, sure, like, we'll have lunch. I didn't think it was a date. I don't know what I thought it was. I was like an old friend, sort
Mhm.
of my family, through the pro-life movement. And I knew his wife had
Sometimes those things
passed.
are hard, though. It's like, is it a
Yes.
date? Is it not? Or
No,
like,
I
what are
didn't
like the
have it.
five different
No,
signs? Like,
exactly
yes,
right.
I
So
feel
in
that.
fact, if I thought it was a date, I think I would have been way less likely to say yes.
Yeah.
So I just thought it was like, he was being nice. And I was in graduate school at the time, and
Mhm.
it was the same graduate school he had gone to. So he had
Oh,
friends there. And so I thought, okay, so it's just like he's reaching out, and that's nice. So we had lunch, and of course we had a great time, like
mhm,
talked the whole time, and come up with books we were both reading and like all sorts of things.
mhm.
And so I think for him it was like, well, I took her out in order to check the box, because your dying wife says, like, I think you guys
Yeah.
would get along, and for the sake of the girls, maybe you should consider getting married. So he kind of hoped like we would have lunch and he could then just forget about it. We had a really nice time. So he asked me out again, which,
Catherine and the
yeah,
audacity of being
yeah.
charming and wonderful and beautiful.
It's
How
like,
could you?
I know. I was like, okay, well, I had a great time. I thought that was fun. But like I said, I didn't think it was a date. There were a couple other guys I was interested in
Mhm,
at the time. And I don't know. I was 22 at the time.
mhm.
And I don't know. I thought like guys whose wives die, they don't get married. It wasn't even in my
Yeah.
mind. Funnily enough, one of the guys I was dating, of course, thought it was a date. He was like, "Well, of course you're going on a date with him. Like, what else is it?" So, silly me. So anyway, yeah,
Mhm,
we kept getting together, and then about a month of those not dates, he
mhm.
he finally told me um, that he's pretty interested in maybe making it a date, and I was like, "Oh no." Like, oh no. Well, because he has a bunch of kids. I'm
Yeah,
in grad school. He's older. I mean, those are not things I had thought about at all. They're definitely not things you think about when you're growing, like when you're imagining who you're going to
exactly.
marry. So then I had to really have a conversation with God about it. But yeah, that's how we started dating.
It kind of goes into one of the questions that someone had submitted. I'm going
Okay.
to save the rest of those ones to the end, but I think
Okay.
it just perfectly goes into it. Do you have any advice for navigating stepping into the role of a step parent?
Yeah. Well, so yes and no. I think, uh, well, we know that there's two ways that kids can end up,
Hmm.
being in that, where you're in that role as a step parent to children.
Hmm.
And our case was the case of like maternal death, or
Hmm.
paternal death can happen. And of course, the other way is like is a family separation or divorce. So I wouldn't want to assume that it would be the same. So I can only offer advice that comes from my own case.
Hmm.
Um, but certainly, I'll just say it up front. My dad had taken me aside, and he's like, look, I get that you guys are in love and you think this is the right thing for you, but he's like, I'm really sorry for you because I think you're going to be unhappy. He had been raised by a stepmom my dad had, and he said, stepmoms are always hated. And I was like, oh, yikes. I was like, that's what I have to look forward to. So, against that backdrop, I do want to say to your listeners, like, that is not the end of our story. Our story did not turn out the way my dad feared. And I have a wonderful, beautiful relationship with all of my stepchildren. So I do want to say that for people who are starting out along that path, that to
Hmm.
like believe in love, like they think it's possible, um, and to trust that Christian marriage, if that's the basis of your family, that it can, that God's grace can really flow and heal,
Hmm.
and not to expect everything all at once. Like nobody felt like a family on day one,
Yeah.
but but that just building, like just trying to enjoy them and building like little by little. And I think I said this in your interview that you wrote
Hmm.
up, right? That I
Yeah.
didn't know how to be a mom at the beginning, and I feel like there's a lot of virtue in just playing the part, like
Hmm.
reading stories. I thought bedtime stories made sense. So trying to do all those things that, and asking other friends was like, well, uh, so you're like, okay, I got to cook dinner. Well, I'm a terrible cook. Okay, or like I'll cook something.
Hmm.
So just trying to play the part, I think, with God's grace,
Hmm.
together with just putting the time in. I'm here to say, like, it works. It really does work, and you really can build. So anyway, yeah, it's
And now you
those are my
guys are
simple. Yeah.
celebrating, isn't it 25 years in
Yes.
August?
25 years this year.
Happy
which
be early anniversary.
yes, exactly. It'll be 25 in August. And we did a little getaway last week in
Mhm.
Lake Tahoe. My brother has a home he invited
Nice.
us to use. So we went away in May for the 25th anniversary of our engagement, and then August
Oh.
is the we were only engaged for 3 months, but so
Mhm.
it was a quick we knew pretty quickly. Um, but yeah, where did it go? Is I definitely want to say where did it go? How long have you been married?
I have been married for 4 years. Yeah.
Okay,
We've been
yeah.
together for 10 coming this
Wow,
September.
wow. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah. Yeah, it's a really one of my daughters because all my girls that I raised, the ones that were
Mhm.
5 and 7 and 9,
Mhm.
um, uh, and also because because mom had passed, so
Yeah.
there wasn't any like competition, so to speak.
Mhm.
I mean, like those things that sometimes can be really hard. Was it? But
Yeah.
even still, well, one of my girls when she after she got married, so they're all grown now and married with children. So
Mhm.
but she said something like, it didn't have to work out so well.
Mhm.
And so, you look, but I feel like that is, we can all say that about our lives, right? Like,
Yeah.
even if we didn't become stepmoms, we look at the like mess of who we are, who we started out as, and we just like,
Mhm.
goodness, like everything I touched could have just turned to dust, right? Because actually,
Yes,
like,
absolutely.
that's just me, like on my
Yeah.
own. So yeah, to look back over 25 years and just see that like this thing that we created, this marriage, which was a marriage like after a death and a
Yeah.
tragedy, right? Didn't have to work out so well. And certainly I wasn't like, I was this young 23-year-old with no experience, but
Yeah.
so you look back and you go, whoa, like, wow. And it does feel a little bit like you're looking at something holy,
Mhm.
you know,
Yeah.
because you look at your own deficiencies and your
Mhm.
weaknesses, and your husband has some too. And yeah, and you kind of go, wow, like God is really faithful, and we have to be patient. Um, but
Absolutely.
yeah, I think there's lots to be hopeful about if you're a step mom or dad. Yeah.
Sometimes it's like so funny to me how, this little, I mean, granted, in the larger scheme of things, it's just a little bit of time, but how
Yes.
quickly it's flown by and how much we've both grown and grown together
Yes.
during that time. Because, like, we were 19, 20 when we got together, and we
Amazing.
were crazy, crazy kids. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
I escaped a cult. He grew up a religious. It was a whole
Amazing.
thing. And
Amazing.
now we're a Christian couple.
Isn't that amazing? And praise God. Like
Absolutely.
that's
1000%
yeah.
accepting.
Yeah. Yeah. Praise God.
Yeah.
It's incredible. Right. I mean, I didn't again, I just like this is why I won't send my own children to the type of college I went to. In part not to be presumptuous, right? Like
Mhm.
I flirted with like all kinds of ridiculous things. And yeah, God plucked me out of this and all this grace, but I wouldn't want to send my own kids into the belly of the beast and say like, "Oh, God will save you too." Like I don't think that's how it works.
Yeah.
Right?
It can
So,
definitely be big iffy.
I mean, I don't want to be presumptuous, I guess is the idea,
Mhm.
right? Like I want to try to do better for my kids than
Yeah.
I had. So, but yeah, wow, what a grace. And again, especially like we're not in a culture that really super values marriage, I think. Is that fair to
Exactly.
say? I don't know. Like it's like I look around, I think, is it fair to say that people don't value marriage? I don't think they do.
I don't think they do either. A
Or they
lot.
take it for granted, like even if
Yeah.
they are married, right?
A lot of people, at least in like my peer group in my area, seem to be like, "Oh, it's a piece of paper." Like, there's no difference between, doing this, and because
Yeah.
of the fact that it's when it's secular, it's separated from the sacrament.
Mm.
And so when it's not that sacramental
Yes.
sacredness, I mean,
Yes.
my husband and I even struggled with this for a time before we became Christian, because we were like, okay, like, well, we're together, we're doing
Right.
all of the same things essentially. Like, we don't see
Yeah.
any big difference
Yeah.
between.
Yeah.
And then we were like, oh, okay, so we do have to do that. Okay.
Yeah.
When Christ came into the picture, we're like, okay, we got you. You
Yeah.
invented this for a reason, and we're sorry.
Right. 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 Yeah. I think that's right. I was just reading a really old book,
Mhm.
which maybe I can send you a link later.
Yeah.
It was written in 1928 by a Catholic priest who was saying in 1928 that marriage seemed like it was under attack in the United States. He was
Mhm.
American. And it's funny because, like, this is 100 years ago. And of like, oh, it was already under attack then, but he was convinced it was like that everybody was out to destroy marriage. But his conclusion was just what you just said. He said that the mistake that people were making in his time, I mean, 1928, was to
Mhm.
begin to think that marriage was an economic convenience rather than a sacrament. And he was like,
Yeah.
the only thing that will save marriage is is for us to rediscover that it's a sacrament and stop it with the economic convenience. And I thought, oh my jaw hit the floor. I was like, this is 100 years ago. So
Yes.
yeah, super
That's
great.
that's incredible too, because I
Right.
mean, it totally shifts the way you view it when it's like, oh, it's just another step into the relationship.
Right.
And there
Right.
in chat there is a couple. I think it's very fair to say, and imagine if you saw it now. Knowing what my husband's with me for the long run makes
Yeah.
me feel secure.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, just that basic sense that, you know, um, like people focus a lot, I think, but it's like the wrong thing. Like they focus on whether they are happy and
Mhm.
fulfilled. But you're like, hang on a second, are you, here's a person who's been putting up with me. Right.
Yeah.
So, and that is incredible. So just to flip it around, like, what am I such a catch? I mean, like,
Yeah.
but just to sort of like, I just like to be grateful. So like the person who says, knowing my husband is with me in the long run makes me feel secure. Like,
Mhm.
it's so grateful, like to be so grateful to have one other person who's just want to be there for you. For it's just, and I think gratitude is like the key to avoiding that kind of like me first sort of attitude.
Mhm.
Oh,
Absolutely.
oh, he doesn't wear exactly the kind of ties I'd like, or he's, I've become a yoga person and he doesn't yoga with me, or like it's all
Mhm.
of this kind of like they're not changing with me in the right place or the right direction. You're like, wait a second, he's putting up with you,
Exactly.
right?
And that's been our one singular disagreement throughout our entire relationship. He
Mhm.
thinks he has it better. I think I have it better.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
we'll probably reach our,
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
the Notebook deathbed, holding each
Yeah,
other's
you'll
hands
be in
with
the
still not
crate,
agreeing with
the
that.
yeah, the Cracker Barrel rocking chairs with the, I
Yes,
still have it better. Yeah,
exactly.
it's really a mystery, right?
Yeah.
Because right, humanly speaking, I get it. Like if you don't have grace, it doesn't look like two people can put up with each other. I mean, man, people like my kids. I mean, look at my kids. They're like,
Yeah.
they love each other. At the same time, they're on they're at each other's throats all the time, and it's always silly things. It's like,
Mhm.
but of course, they're not married to each other. They don't have the grace to put up with each other's weaknesses and to
Mhm.
forgive each other. So yeah, they love each other, but they're not going to live together forever, right?
Yeah.
I think most of them are happy about that.
Yes. And I think that, when we look at how Christ loved the church, because that's the ultimate example of marriage, that it really helps and shows us that, okay, like the church is made up of all of the imperfect people,
Yeah,
and Christ is obviously the perfect one.
yeah,
And if he can consistently forgive us and show up for us,
right,
then that
right,
should be,
yeah,
how we show up for our spouse as well.
right, 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 exactly. And then all the all the growth that can take place and the healing that can take place, knowing that however bad it is, I had a friend who used to tell me that she was convinced that if she ever walked away from her husband,
Mhm.
like, she decided to leave or go hang out with another guy, that she
Mhm.
expected that her husband was going to like come after her, like, and set up a tent. Like he would set up a tent outside wherever she moved to, and he would sit in the tent and just be on the front lawn and declare like, "You're my husband, you're my wife," like. And I thought it was such a great image of sort of like that kind of faithfulness, like, and maybe then you wake up and you think, oh, I made a mistake, but gosh, like we're just so lacking in that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
um and so many people are just carrying around lifelong wounds from being abandoned.
Yeah. One of the viewers says, so many times when it was so bad, so many people said to leave him. Now he's saved and an amazing dad and husband. Seek God's marriage advice,
Yeah,
not the people who will tell you to
yeah,
like leave and stuff. Amen. I
that's
can't
really
imagine life.
powerful.
No. Yeah.
That's so powerful, right?
Yeah.
And that's so important too. That people can be really terrible spouses, and they can change, right? Like that there's hope, and huge conversions. People who are unfaithful, people who have, addictions. I've seen all those kinds of recoveries with grace.
Exactly.
It's interesting how something that I don't know if you read or follow Mary Harrington,
Mhm.
who
I don't think I've heard of her.
she wrote a book. It's a little bit, it's a little edgy. She's not Christian, but she tells it like it is, and she wrote a
Mhm.
book called Feminism Against Progress. I think that's
Oh,
the title. I
I'll have
think
to check
that's the
it out.
title. So she's one of the sort of
Mhm.
anti-feminists that's bouncing around. She's British. Um, and but she makes this great point about how what we see in the media all the time is the
Mhm.
stories of the marriages that don't make it because
Mhm.
people talk about them. And she said, but you know what? The marriages that make it,
Mhm.
she said, a lot of them are going to be marriages that go through these things, like the one that you just read about, when he was a bad husband and then he was
Mhm.
saved and became a great husband. Because the problem is when you want to write about the change, you have
Mhm.
to write about the bad things.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
nobody who's still married to somebody and loving them wants to write about their bad things, right? And so she
Exactly.
pointed this out, like you're not going to read those stories too often because the successes don't want to write. They don't want to embarrass each other.
Yeah,
But that just tells us like they're out there, but
exactly.
we're not going to see them in the press all the time. And that really struck me. I thought she's got a great point there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And it was 10 years and 3 kids, and I stuck it out. Verbal, mental, financial abuse. The
Mhm.
last 4 years, so different. Don't give up. 10 years of praying and sticking it out. And
Absolutely
now
amazing.
they're an incredible couple, and I go to her with a bunch of my little Christian wifey questions.
Mhm. Amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah. My husband and I sometimes end up being put in touch with other people who are like new
Mhm.
marriages after a death.
Mhm.
And so we were just with a couple like that a couple days ago who sought us out through mutual friends and said, like I think in their case, her first husband had passed away
Mhm.
from a lung cancer, like a lung cancer in his 20s, and he didn't smoke.
Oh.
Like, I mean, those are terrible cases. Like, you're like, why,
Yeah.
how? But she had 3 little boys, and then her husband passed away, and she married this lovely, yeah, lovely. Actually, he was a good friend of her husband.
Oh.
Um, but they're struggling, and
Yeah.
it's hard. So people come in, and so I was going to say, just to your point about having mentor couples, if we can't read about it in the media, like being
Mhm.
willing to share privately about like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
we went through that hardship and that is really hard. When you're the second wife or the second
Mhm.
husband, there's so many pitfalls that can arise. But yeah, just I think this is one of the hugest gifts that churches bring, Christian
Absolutely.
churches, to this country and to cultures in general, is this like inner richness or wealth mentoring isn't even the right word, right? It's like a richer thing than that.
Yeah.
It's
It's
almost like
truly
adoption,
transcendent.
right? It's
Yeah.
like new parents or adopted aunts and uncles or older sisters and brothers. I suppose sisters and brothers is the best way to put it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I absolutely cherish about our
Mhm.
little finding the faith community, because even though we're all kind of remotely flung across North America, not even just
Right.
the United States, but like North America, that we're always there for each other. We
Mhm.
always spend Friday nights Bible study all together. We find different times during the week to come together in our Discord group, and it's
Okay.
so tremendous.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, this is stuff that you can't buy. No, I mean it's like great.
Yeah.
It's life-saving, but you can't get it anywhere. How cool. That's great.
It's really incredible. So getting back to yours, kind of what advice would you give to young couples who are just starting their marriage?
Just starting marriage. Okay. Yeah, there's a couple things. Things that we like figured out, um advice. Don't go to bed angry. Like try to work through it. That can be really hard. I've learned this. That can be really hard. Like I'm a more of a night person and my husband
Mhm.
is not a night person. And so I would sometimes bring up things like before bed
Mhm.
on this principle, like you don't want to go to bed angry. But then he's really tired because he's not
Mhm.
a night person. And
Yeah.
so that would lead to like further problems. So I think definitely avoiding going to bed angry. However, if you're the one who's like more of a night person, don't bring up stuff out of the blue. We used to, um, in the early years, especially, we used to practice like we would say good night, but we would also like ask forgiveness for anything we'd done wrong during that day. Even if there wasn't anything on our minds, we would just,
Yeah.
and that was a great thing to do, I think, at the beginning of our marriage. Um, Another thing we've learned over time, again, just by making mistakes, like
Mhm.
don't argue from you always do this. Just
Mhm.
don't ever say it. Just forget it.
Yeah.
Delete it from your expressions. It has to be like this is something, that you're bringing
Mhm.
up. But you always this. No, no. Whatever it is, they don't always. And so like
Exactly.
it's just going to change the way that sort of
Yeah.
sounds. Um, but I would say certainly those are some of the don'ts, things that we tried not to do. We've tried not to fight in front of our children
Mhm.
as much. I say tried because my parents fought a lot in front of us, and I've tried not to do that. It does sometimes have that thing where the kids are like, "Oh, we know that they're not happy with each other,
Mhm.
and like they're gonna," but then they know like, "Oh, they're gonna go work it out somewhere else." But
Yeah.
still, I just think there's a blessing to trying to work it out somewhere else. Um,
Absolutely.
and on that same note, because again, something I was exposed to as a kid that I think was
Mhm.
not at all good is try not to criticize your spouse around, to your children.
Yeah.
Well, dad always plays golf when I tell him not to, or whatever, like
Mhm.
whatever or dad is such a mean person, or dad, just whatever. So I
I think
really
it
try not
yeah.
to criticize. Go
I
ahead.
think that kind of falls under like some type of parental alienation, which when people
Yeah.
are going through, a divorce or they're separated, it's like, okay, we know not to do this. But
Right.
sometimes in marriages, that's still a thing that happens,
Yeah. Yeah.
even though that's not, the ultimate end goal.
Yeah. That's right. I think figuring out what the other person really like loves the most or appreciates more. I think people sometimes use the language of like, oh, their love language. That might be a
Mhm.
little cheesy. But you kind of figure out, you're like, oh, actually, usually you see it pretty quickly. But if you don't, you try to ask, like, try to find out what they really thrive on. If it's
Mhm.
words of affirmation, um, or or you realize like if they're not being respected, whatever that is, like figuring out what that
Yeah.
is. um, I I really like fashion and clothes more than I should. I think it's probably
Mhm.
not super Christian or virtuous that I do, but I do. So my husband at some point figured this out. He doesn't like that at all. But he
Mhm.
would start to like, look through magazines and be like, "Well, do you like this?" Or do you like, and so he would try to figure out what I might like
Mhm.
and then go and pick it out for me. And it's such a great example of something like he really goes out of his comfort zone. He doesn't like to shop. He doesn't like clothing. He
Yeah.
would probably wear the same shirt and trousers like probably our whole
Yes.
marriage if I if I wasn't like, dude, like there's like
I feel
holes in
that.
this one. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So I think that's an example of him really trying to figure out how to do something that it wasn't his normal space, but
Mhm.
like I think it's so cute.
That's
So
absolutely adorable.
for sure. Yes, I think, I don't know if that's your husband or somebody else, but yeah,
That is
I
my
agree.
husband.
I agree with him. I think constructive criticism is fine. And my children, our children see us argue a lot because I mean, we're both academics. We argue a lot. But I definitely think the difference between like, okay, wait a second, honey, like I disagree with you. Let's like talk this one out
Yeah.
versus just like, why are you so mean? You're such a mean person, right? That
Yeah.
is like, so I try to avoid the latter. I'm not perfect, but try to avoid the latter. And then I
I
was going to say
think
on the
mhm.
positive side, like dates and just like time together. I think people say dates, and I think a lot of people think that means money.
Mhm.
But for us, a lot of our quote unquote dates are just walks. We just go walking together and make time to talk. Sometimes we'll just get in the car and drive. It's like let's take a drive someplace.
That's
So a
awesome.
lot of quality
One
time.
For sure.
Yeah.
One of the biggest lessons my husband and I learned early on in our relationship was to fight the problem or
Mm,
the idea not each other.
Right.
Because if we're going to partner and actually attack the issue instead of attacking each other, we're being much more efficient with what, energy and resources and everything else we have.
Right. Right. No, that's a great way to put it. Exactly. Exactly. Which is yeah, part of this, like, yeah, not you. It's not you that
Mhm.
I have a problem with. It's this particular, or even this particular behavior, the thing that you said. Um
Yeah.
yeah, those are all things. It's funny, when we were younger, I think we did have this we would go when we would spend time together on either a date, or if we got a little bit of vacation time together, we would always say, like, okay, we'll take stock and we'll, like, go over
Mhm.
the year and our goals and things. And it's not like that's not important, but it's funny, as the years have gone by, we've probably done less of that than we did when we were younger. I think when we
Mhm.
were younger, we had a lot more of this kind of, like, almost like marriage was like a thing we were gonna do. We were gonna,
Mhm.
like, get a clipboard and, like, come up with a program and a plan. And, for
Mhm.
certainly for me, coming from a broken marriage, I thought seemed like a really good idea. But maybe it's the 25 years. I don't know, but I think we do a little bit less of that now. Um, Maybe because, and I don't know if this is going to sound like we've given up, but it's more like, I think maybe you sort of, after this long, you're like, well, okay, I can, th- there's a certain number of things that you just have learned to accept
Yeah.
me. And I think that's okay. It's all right to
Mhm.
accept some things that you just go, well, this isn't probably ever going to be perfect. But it's not, it doesn't define us. It's not who we are.
Yeah.
It's just, you get what you get. Like, God puts this couple together, and yeah, and that's all
Yeah.
right. Uh, it's all right to be at peace with, like, that thing.
Yeah. I can definitely see that. And that makes a lot of sense because I feel like sometimes it can be a little bit intimidating when you're first like dating and trying to really get into like finding your ideal person, that it has to be like this whole list of like all of these ideals, all of these perfect things, and then you
Yeah.
actually meet the person that's perfect for you and you're like, oh, so
Yeah.
that part,
Yeah.
like those like three things, the fact that he's ever seen like this is
Yes.
so embarrassing, but when I was 17, I swore that my husband had to be a massive Doctor Who fan. Otherwise, it just was not it for me.
Totally.
Because I was a super total nerd. But he
Yes.
had never seen Doctor Who, and I wasn't really that big of a Star Wars fan. But you know what?
Yeah.
We
There you
still
are.
made it work.
That's so true. Yeah, that I think
Um,
that's right. And I don't, yeah, I definitely didn't want it to sound like giving up. It's not that, as much as, like, you somehow just age into each other, or you just
mhm,
kind of, like, I don't know. I don't know. It's not like it's disappointing. It's just,
mhm.
yeah, it's like we don't have to go over everything anymore. We're just like, I don't know, we're tired for that. Let's just, like, sit in the hot tub and look at
Yeah.
the mountains and be grateful.
It kind of feels like
Yeah.
accepting them for what they are instead of accepting what they're not.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Does that?
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think I remember when I was first married, I had this
Mhm,
idea that maybe what we do when we get married is we meet people, you can never really know them. Like, well, at least not
mhm.
before you're married, right?
Yeah.
You don't know them perfectly. And so, you kind of have this, like, I don't know, like this Rembrandt in your head or whatever it
Mhm,
is. It's like this is like this image of who your husband is, or your
mhm,
wife. It's like a painting or a work of art, where it's actually, like, it's beautiful, and
mhm.
it's kind of idealistic in the way that a work of
Yeah.
art is, but it's one dimensional, right? It's flat. And I think for the first several years, or I don't know, maybe for me it was almost 10 years. I mean,
Mhm,
you just kept thinking the job of your marriage was to get all the depth in there, but you were still expecting the depth to, like, resolve itself
mhm.
into some kind of deeper version of this Rembrandt that you had in your mind.
Yeah.
But later you have to realize, like, that's not who you married. Like, who you married isn't this thing that was in your mind, this idealistic thing. That who you married is a subject of God, right? Who you married is
Exactly.
is God's creation. And you didn't paint your husband, right? God
Exactly.
painted your husband. And so, actually, what your job is, and I think this is what you were saying,
Mhm.
accepting who they are and not what they're not. your job is as a wife is to finally enjoy who they are and not try to keep fitting them into this mold of who
Yeah.
you thought would be the right person. And I think that's just time. Like there's no shortcut to that. And it takes
Yeah.
some humility to realize, like, however much you thought you were the clear-headed, like, rational person when you got married, or right? Like, at some point, you're like, no, like anybody else, I idealized this person. And it's
Yes.
a little bit scary to say that because you think, well, I don't know if I can make it once I accept that what I said yes to was an idealization that was more my own creation
Mhm.
than who he is fully. Will I
Yeah.
still be able to love this other person? I think that's the scary thing that people go through, and I think a lot of people don't make it through that,
Yeah.
right?
But I also think that if you're blessed enough and you make that daily conscious choice to get there and kind of
Yes.
surpass that, that you're rewarded so beautifully and that love can become even more tangible to the point where you can kind of like hold it and like look at it and like,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, I think that's right. And then that's where the mystery of God's grace comes in because I think it's I don't know. I feel like there's some acceptable like catchphrase out there that I'll
Mhm.
get wrong because I get all my metaphors wrong and right. But it's like to really love somebody to know
Mhm.
to like a human being. Like human beings are pretty we're pretty mixed up.
Yes.
Like we've got all this
That's
lovable
the
stuff, but
sign.
we also have this unlovable stuff. And that's that's where the grace comes in, right?
Yeah.
And because we sense that we're not really that lovable deep down, we sense that like that's we have a hard time accepting that God loves us with the problems and not for our perfections, right?
Mhm.
I think we just
Exactly.
we throw that onto other people too. So we once we sort of realize like, oh no, wait a second, I married a human being. Like, oh
Yeah.
no, like crisis. Like I didn't marry God. I didn't marry like a whatever, a cartoon image.
Yeah.
And that's that's where the like the leaning into your faith. I mean, that's where I just think marriage without faith is a it's just a huge challenge.
Yeah.
Much huger. It's a challenge for all of us, but I just think there's a piece of doing the impossible that comes in, and we just need supernatural help.
Exactly. With that help and without that perfect example of, Christ in the church, I don't know
Right,
that would be here right now.
right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But and then, adding kids to it,
Mm.
like how has being the mother of 8 children contributed to your personal sanctification and spiritual growth?
Oh my goodness, that's a big question.
I know.
Um, yeah. Uh, little by little. Yeah, little by little, I think. I think like the most easy thing to say, which I think a
Mhm.
lot of moms would say, is like it's like you don't realize there's just all these layers of realizing how self-focused you are.
Mhm.
Like, you get married, you're like, I'm going to love you alone. And you're just, you're so like, I'm going to love you. But of course, like we just were describing, 5 minutes into marriage, you're like, oh, I don't like that food that you like. You're like, I want to eat the food I like. And you're like, oh, well,
Yeah.
there's all my idealism out the door. And so you think like just getting used to your husband is a lot of like letting go of yourself. And it really is. And we're not even that good at it. Um,
Yes.
but then I just think that's what children does.
Mhm.
And we've been really blessed. But yeah, it's like I remember with the first baby, it was like, oh man, like, oh, seriously, my life is never going to be normal again. My
Mhm.
marriage won't be normal again. I thought our marriage was over. I thought like not,
Mhm.
not like on the rocks over, but I thought we wouldn't enjoy each other's company anymore because we were just going to
Mhm.
have this baby always around. And of course, that's ridiculous. That's not how it worked out, but that's how it seemed at the beginning.
Mhm.
So, so I think the most obvious thing to say, I think there's more interesting things, but the most obvious thing is just like, it's like a dose effect that each
Mhm.
baby, it's like a medicine you can take for your selfishness, and every baby
Mhm.
like strips a little bit more away from you. Um, and that's a good thing, right? And it's not
Yeah.
like children are the only thing that can do that. All kinds of hard things that are demanding can do that for us, but children certainly do do that. So I would say that's probably the most important thing. And they do it in a way that doesn't depend on you having the virtue at the beginning. And that's all I mean there is like, you're not actually, I don't know. It's like you're not really actually that self-giving. You're just like, but
Mhm.
the baby needs to eat. Okay. Like, or there's like a
Yeah.
dirty diaper. Okay. So someone is going to have to change this dirty diaper. Or I mean,
Yeah,
I
certain
take it
logistical
there's going to
things
be
need
an
to
adorable
occur.
cat in this video at some point. Like the cat
Yes.
I've been promised to see. We have two dogs, and
Mhm.
like I was out with my dog this afternoon, and she like ate grass and threw up.
Mhm.
And sometimes she eats grass and throws up in my living room. And, like
Yeah.
nobody wants to clean that up, but you're like, all right, I'm getting up.
Yes.
So I
Especially
just,
before they like eat it and clean it up
oh,
themselves.
exactly. I mean, just, yeah, you just
Yeah.
have to do it because you have to do it
Mhm.
little by little. If you do this over and over and over, it just makes you better, I think. And like
Mhm.
I said, I always want to stress this for people who aren't, haven't in God's, infinite wisdom, haven't been
Mhm.
blessed with children yet. There's other things that could do this, but I think that children are particularly effective at driving out like our laziness and our
Mhm.
self-centeredness. So that's probably the most obvious thing. But maybe the less obvious thing to say is that your children are just these like, when you see a giraffe. I mean, I
Mhm.
haven't seen a giraffe in a long time.
I rode one once.
I
It was
don't see
weird.
them on a regular basis. So like, like you see where I was
Mhm.
just in California with my husband, and there's this bird that I've
Mhm.
never seen before. It has a black head and a blue body, and
Mhm.
maybe some of you guys know what that looks like. It's called a stellar jay, I think. Anyway,
Oh,
some kind
cool.
of like western blue jay,
Mhm.
but it was like so bright blue, and so you see these things that I just always think like it really provides a window into God's creativity. It
Mhm.
helps me to love God more because I'm like, oh, you made up this cool bird with a black head and a blue body, and
Yeah.
that's so cool. Or like the giraffe, and you just keep going. You're like, oh my goodness, these other things. So I think that the more interesting thing that's true about children is the more children you have, it's like they're all because each child is like a different animal
Mhm.
in that sense. Because an infinite human soul, right? They're
Yeah.
what does it mean that you're an infinite person that is not God and not any other person, right? So it's like this new person. And in a sense, like in terms of what personality means, like
Mhm.
it's like a whole new species. Like there's never been this person before, and there never
Yeah.
will be this, unrepeatable person again. And so I'm so delighted by them. Like they're just so different from each other. And
Mhm.
so I think the best thing I could say there is like it's been such a gift to it's like to have these different people that all just give like they point back to God for me. So you
Mhm.
just each of them you're like, well, I've never met you before and you are so incredible. And so God must be so incredible because he came up with you, right? So
Mhm.
that's
Exactly.
been a huge piece of motherhood for me is just like gosh, like just oh my goodness, like if God could make these 8 human beings each so
Mhm.
different and each so lovable, my goodness, like what must God be like?
Exactly. That's
So,
so cool. That's
yeah.
amazing. And now with being a
Yeah.
grandmother, like that,
I know.
what's it like? Do they have like a little, I mean, I know they're
Yeah.
very little, but is there
Yes.
a nickname you hope to be called? Like, what's it like being a grandmother so far?
Yeah, just it's still, new. Well, you new and
Mhm.
old, and I don't wanna neglect to say yeah, my stepchildren,
Mhm.
my older girls, they all have grandbabies too.
Oh,
So,
cool.
yeah, so I try to, like, kind of respect their privacy,
Mhm.
so I don't always post about their children too, but they're there. There you can find them actually. You find them in the older tweets. They're there. But
Mhm.
yeah, but I would say for sure it's different. Like the
Mhm.
son of mine who had his first baby in April with his wife. Yeah, you just keep pinching yourself. You're like, okay, all right, Greg lived in my tummy. And
Mhm.
this is his baby. Like, okay, you're just like, oh my goodness, this is my baby's baby. All right. So still kind of getting used to that, which
Mhm.
seems like really huge and really a blessing. I don't have a name I'm hoping to be called. I kind of am hoping, yeah, in with my own children growing up,
Mhm.
my husband's mom was grandma, and my mom was a nana. Uh, so I don't know. I guess I guess I need to get my act together and figure it out. But so far, I think it's been grandma. But
I love that. That's
I
really
mean,
cute.
she's like, yeah, I think most other kids, it's grandma, um, but I always liked grandma with the first name, right,
Mhm.
rather than the last name, because I like the sort of
Yeah,
intimacy of that. Like, so
it makes a lot of
that's
sense.
a mouthful. Grandma Catherine is a mouthful, so might have to figure out shorten it somehow. We'll see.
Grandma
They'll
Cat.
shorten it for yeah, they'll shorten it for
Exactly.
us because the kids always come up with that. Yeah,
Exactly. Even
yeah,
if it's like, I mean, I, don't have that blessing yet because I'm not a
yeah,
mom yet,
yeah,
but I am Tia Fifi
yeah, yeah. That's
to
so
my
cute.
one of my little nephews, and he's
That's so
just
cute.
so adorable.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm
I'm
literally
I'm really
obsessed.
looking forward to it. As they get older, and I know, like with little babies, it takes
Mhm,
a while. They don't remember you. You'll see them, even if you see them, every few weeks. They won't
mhm.
necessarily remember you for a while.
Yeah,
So, but they live 4 hours away. So hopefully, as she gets older, we'll see her often enough that she won't
that's
like think
awesome.
I'm a perfect stranger.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
that's incredible.
yeah,
And speaking of, some of your more distant kids, as
yes,
being a professor, so
yeah.
how has your role as professor at a Catholic university contributed to your spiritual growth?
So that's a great question. I'm going to say something embarrassing, which is like, I think I was teaching for more than 5 years before I really realized that besides just sort of talking about God in my classes, which I did, I mean, everybody knew I was, super religious and loved my faith. But this is embarrassing. It took me more than 5 years of teaching before I realized I need to pray for my students. And then, like, around that same time, I realized I need to tell them that I'm praying for them, right? And
Yeah.
so I think around that same time, I started handing out little slips of paper, and I would do this near Christmas, and I would do it again near Easter. And I don't want to like, but I would say to them, look, like, I'm gonna be praying for you,
Mhm.
and so if you want to put any particular intention that you have on your heart, it could be for you, for anybody that you love, and you can put your name on it. You can not put your name on it, but just put them in this pile, and I will take them home and I'll pray about them. And I just want to say that, like, in terms of my spiritual growth, I
Mhm.
think looking back as a teacher, that's when it started. I think it started to grow more, and I think God wanted me to do that. I just I just didn't like I feel like an idiot. Like why like I was but part of it is because I think that when we live in a world that's so secular and all of
Mhm.
my education, my college education was so secular. I mean, nobody ever
Mhm.
prayed with us or for us. And I think, my goodness, we're just such creatures of habit. We just
Yeah.
do the types of things that we are used to doing. And so, actually, to be honest, I was very sick that year,
Mhm.
and I don't know if there's a direct connection in my mind, but clearly, like, God wanted me to, go deeper.
Mhm.
And so that was like, I think of it as a turning point when I started to see that I should not just pray for them in general, but like ask them how they
Mhm.
wanted to be prayed for. And then I realized, like, oh, aha, like there's a kind of motherhood here
Mhm.
that it's not just like a symbol, like a
Mhm.
teacher is like a mother. It's not like just it's actually real. Like I can
Yeah.
actually sort of adopt them spiritually and if they know that. So I think that's yeah, I'd like to say that
Yeah.
was something that I feel stupid it took me that long to realize, like, this is what I should be doing here, is saying, how can I pray for you,
It's
and
so
letting them know
beautiful.
that. But yeah, that's so I think that's a big piece of it.
We have she actually leads our Bible study, but my friend Jess, she's a teacher at
Mhm.
I think I'm like 90% sure it's a Catholic
Sure.
school.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that she does like every week. She's like, okay, guys, like this is where we're at with like the curriculum and like the school
Yeah.
schedule. If you guys could, please pray for my students as they're going through their finals or
Yeah.
they just graduated. And I know that that was such an exciting thing for her because it's her first year at a religious
Yeah.
school.
It
So,
changes everything. I do. Uh, yeah, to just have
yeah.
to have that freedom, not only to talk about your own faith, but actually to let them know that you're in a faith, like you're in a faith, and actually,
Mhm.
like, you tell them straight up, like, I know they're not all religious, and some of
Mhm.
them are not, but you're like, you can still pray for people. So you just like,
Exactly.
okay, it doesn't matter, but anything that you're struggling with, that you want help with, like, I don't know, it's what a blessing to be able to say that in the classroom. I would not want to teach at a place where I couldn't share that with my students.
Yeah. It's made, as her friend watching her, work in a public school and then transition over to a religious school, it's been
Yeah.
such a blessing for her. And it's been a blessing for me getting to see, her be blessed by this.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So that's probably my number one thing. Yeah, is that. Now I would also say there's like um I think there's the piece of like, which I think as a Christian parent, you feel this too.
Mhm.
That sort of like you realize that you teach with your life more than what you say,
Mhm.
right? So you kind of recognize. So what that does is you know that they're watching, they know that
Mhm.
they're looking so much for integrity. So it really does motivate you to be better. Right. So you think like, okay, like what, yeah, I don't know, like whatever dumb thing, whatever it might be,
Mhm.
it's like there's this, it calls you to a higher level. You want to be better because your students are expecting you to be good. And
Exactly.
that's good. I mean, your kids are too, right?
Yeah.
So that's good. Yeah.
Now, when it comes to your other, academic pursuits outside of your students, how has your faith influenced them in how you approach like researching and such?
Mm. That's been a 20-year, in some sense, this book is the first like expression of that.
Mhm.
And not the only, but like the most complete one. That's a really hard thing, right? So we
Mhm.
say that we believe that faith and reason work together and
Mhm.
they're not at odds, right? Like that
Yeah.
things that we would know through maybe science or social science
Mhm.
or even just reflection or observation. We don't have to be so sciencey about it, but we think that I mean, here's an example, just to be very clear,
Mhm.
because I think examples are helpful. I mean,
Yeah.
so one of the reasons I wanted to study economics in the first place is because I was
Mhm.
pro-life. And does my faith affect being pro-life? Of course it does, right?
Mhm.
Just a huge piece of that story.
Absolutely.
And as a young woman, when I was in high school and early part of college, I don't think I wrote about this in the book. I don't think so. So I don't think I'm boring anybody. But as a young woman, um, uh, I I I did some research and work at the National Institutes of Health,
Mhm.
and not on pro, not related to pro life. So I was there just because I thought I wanted to be a doctor,
Mhm.
and that's what you do. You're in high school and you want to do research and do medicine.
Mhm.
So I was at the National Institutes of Health near DC, and there were people, so this was in the 1990s,
Mhm.
early to mid 1990s, and people were still very worried about the AIDS epidemic at the
Yeah.
time. And people that I worked with, so the part of the NIH that I worked at
Mhm.
was devoted to AIDS research, among other things. And many people that I worked with would say, for lunch or just offhandedly, that probably after all, AIDS was going to be a good thing for the planet and for society because there were certainly too many people, right?
Oof.
And I
Yeah.
was like, okay, no, like, wait a second, wait a second, you know, and so really made me think like, well, this is this question of faith and reason, right? So I thought, well, is it, could it possibly be the case that God created us to welcome life and to have babies? But we needed to go out and like kill them off somehow. And so here are these people who are kind of privately celebrating a disease because they thought that like, well, there were probably too many people in Africa, at least, which certainly in Africa, there were too many people. That was seemed to be the view. And I was
Mhm.
just so completely scandalized by this. But then I was puzzled. I thought, well, is it true? Like, is good human development or economic growth, does it require that there's not so many people in Africa or anywhere? So it was like so of course I didn't think so. Faith and reason,
Yeah.
right? So come back to that. Like I believed in faith that God wants people. He asked us to be fruitful, multiply. And then
Mhm.
here are these people like, no, it's good if there's some diseases to delete the population. And I was like, oh my goodness. So there was a
Yeah.
piece of me that just, I wanted to go to graduate school because I wanted to find out if that was true. Now I
Mhm.
know that it's not true. It's actually a big lie.
Yeah.
And like you grow up and you realize actually there's a lot of people responsible for telling the truth who don't tell the truth and it's not true.
Exactly.
Right. So that's its own disappointment and a kind of scandal in a certain way. But yeah, so you asked about my faith and my
Mhm.
research life. And I think um, I would say that I've been inspired by the idea that truth is one,
Mhm.
and that God doesn't things aren't true over here that are false over there, right? And
Yeah.
so looking for ways that with the eyes of faith we might find things in different parts of science or social science that we might not have been inspired to look without the eyes of faith, but that we might be able to bring something to the table. Yeah. So that's been my approach generally.
Mhm.
But the trouble, of course, is that in science and social science, we don't have a language for talking about faith in a kind of quote unquote sciencey way.
Mhm.
And that's a
That makes a lot
problem.
of
That's a
sense.
very big problem. So this book is kind of the beginning of my own field and area of trying to find a way to do that. How to bring the experience of religious men and women
Mhm.
into the fuller picture of what a flourishing society looks like in a way
Mhm.
that isn't kitsch or ridiculous. Like I used to see
Yeah.
these studies where they would like survey religious people and they would
Mhm.
say things like, how many times in the day do you consult the Bible when you're deciding what to do? And I'm like, that's dumb. Like that's
Yeah,
not how it
that's
works. Like
not
what we're
how it
opening the
works.
Bible like to a random verse and going like, oh, what should I do today? Like let me pick a psalm and decide.
Yeah.
Like is this kind of caricature of what a life of faith looks like. And if you have that caricature,
Mhm.
you're definitely not going to make progress into,
Exactly.
because I'm deeply convicted as a matter of faith
Mhm.
that that being people of faith it, um, is a critical part of like a flourishing society. But we don't have any way to talk about that in social
Yeah.
science. And so yeah, so that's like in my professional life. It's
Mhm.
not my whole life. It's not even the most important part of my life. But in this little space I call my professional life, if I have any job to do, that seems to me like one of my jobs is to sort of press into the place where we look at ways that are not caricatures that
Mhm.
describe the wealth or the value that faith, the eyes of faith brings to a family, to a marriage, to a school, to a community, to a country. And each of those is a different type of project. But yeah.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I responded so much to in your book because it was like trying to figure out the classiest way to say this. I'm
Yeah.
bad at math.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Outside of like shopping and getting really, 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 really good deals, like econ's not my thing. I have a
Yeah.
lot of
Yeah,
respect for
yeah.
people who think that
Yeah.
is for sure. But
Yeah.
so with that, I would never have necessarily like been like, oh, it's
This is a
an econ
book
book.
I
Let
like
me
to
go
read.
grab
Yeah.
it. Let me
Yeah,
go pick
yeah. Of
that up.
course. Of
But
course.
it was so well done that you spoke the language of economics while speaking the language of so many like of the hearts of so many Christian women.
Yeah.
And the merging of that and like the appropriate intelligent and like beautiful integration
Yeah.
was so poignant that it just
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, a lot of people, I've received a lot of notes from people who were like, I didn't expect to like this book. I thought I would dislike this book a lot. But of course, first and foremost, like the women I interviewed get credit for just, those are
Mhm.
just beautiful stories and their hearts are really beautiful. So just trying
Yeah.
to present their hearts, that was actually the hardest part about writing it was feeling like I had been entrusted with something that was really like so beautiful and
Mhm.
thinking like, how do I get this out, but without kind of messing it up or getting in the way
Mhm.
of it, right?
Yeah.
You want it to just, right? Like maybe I think translators must feel this way. My husband translates the gospel sometimes. he's a Greek scholar, and
Oh, cool.
yeah, it's pretty neat. For
Maybe that's
years,
whose
I would
song was
like,
that?
yeah, I would elbow him. Like we'd be
Mhm.
in church and they'd be reading the gospel, and he would be elbowing me and saying like, "That's a terrible translation. That's not how it sounds." And after years, I would say, "Well, will you just translate it for me? Like, do it your way for me, you know?"
Mhm.
But I think that's having like watched him do it so often. I think that translators have that like you want it to sound in the native ear
Mhm.
the way it sounds in the original language. And although I wasn't translating,
Mhm.
but I did want to try to not get in the way. So
Mhm.
that's all. Yeah, for sure. Uh,
It's kind of like you got like a collection of these beautiful gifts, and then you wanted to make sure that they were appropriately packaged and
yeah,
placed lovingly kind of in like a gift box of sorts,
yeah,
and then give them to your audience.
that's right. That is
And
definitely right. Yeah, and you said, "Well, like, you're not a numbers person," and that's fine. But actually, that's part of what I came to say, right, is that
mhm,
data so social science has a numbers problem right now. At least
yes,
I can say that, like, from my like, put my
yes,
professional hat on and say, like, we've gone to this point where we think that it's not data unless it's a number.
mhm,
But that's completely wrong, right? Because what actually, where do those numbers come from? They're meant to be summaries of something that's about a person. But
exactly.
people, right? And I'm like the first to say there's some value in statistics and,
Mhm,
we need to do it well and properly. And of course, you can lie with statistics. We know this.
yes,
There's a lot of lying with statistics going on right now. And we wouldn't have to talk very long before we could name like five things really quickly. Like
literally,
a
yeah.
lot of lying with statistics going on. And it's so, that you can have two responses to that. And I think they're both things that Christians need to do, right? One
Mhm,
of those is to tell the truth with statistics, right? To do statistics correctly or to
mhm,
highlight the places where people are lying
yeah,
with the numbers and they're hiding behind the numbers and using them to tell a story that's false.
mhm,
And that's particularly bad type of lying because, of course, the facade of the number
mhm,
gives whoever's talking this kind of like faux sophistication, like, oh, I have
yeah,
this number, right? And so therefore
mhm,
you have to believe me. And that's really bad. But the other thing that I think Christians can do when we see that we have a number problem
mhm,
is actually like it's the prophecy of like the prophetic voice of the person. So you're like, actually what
mhm,
people need to hear isn't a number right now. What they need to hear is the original type of data, which is a testimony. It's a
yeah,
witness. And of course, like speaking of faith, like the reason we're here talking to each other is because of the witness of the first the first followers of Jesus, right? We
exactly.
don't have any numbers like or statistics to prove like the accuracy of the gospels. We have
Mhm,
eyewitness testimonies and these people they say like the
mhm,
gospel writers say you can trust me because I'm an eyewitness. And so this very basic question about how we believe like what we so I spent a lot of years thinking like what is the nature of data in social science.
mhm,
And so part of what I wanted to do with this book is actually like recover the power of like prophecy,
mhm,
right? And that like why is this story more important than any other story? Well, that's a really great question, right? Like and
yeah,
so in some sense it doesn't depend on me saying it's more important than any other story. It's a question of what it does to the reader, right?
mhm,
And when you read the gospel you go, "Oh, oh, oh." Like this is
mhm,
truth, right?
exactly.
And so when something is true, it's not just hearsay, right? It's not
Mhm,
just propaganda. But the proof of it is outside of us, actually, right? Because we don't
yeah,
create truth, right? Truth is truth with a capital T. So
exactly.
it's a really interesting whole question that um, on the research side, uh, people are like, oh, asking like, well, what value is there in like 50 stories? I'm like, decide for yourself, like in a sense, like,
Exactly.
right. Cause I can't create the value. The value is
Exactly.
there only because it's true or if it's true and that is God's doing. Right.
Yeah. The
Right.
truth in the testimony is observed.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's where you can find the inherent
Yeah.
value of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So in that sense, it's a project that hopes to not just tell a story that isn't being heard, but it hopes to show a path to a type of science that is more humane. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. I really love that.
Yeah. So you can do science too if you don't like numbers. Still.
That's one of my favorite things about both my friend Jess, who I will
Mm,
absolutely have to introduce you to because she's
great.
a legend, um, and you as well, where you like there's these big heady topics, and I find that a lot of people can very easily gatekeep them.
Mm,
And it's like, oh,
yeah.
you have to be like, you have to go here, you have to do this, you have to be like
Yeah.
this amount of smart to be able to do it.
Mm-mm.
And neither of you gatekeep them. You make them so accessible to the point where it's like easy to process and understand for like the average,
Yeah.
person, where you can actually be involved and engaged in it and engage with the work itself.
Yeah. I think of it as like a light under a bushel basket, right? Like it's
Yeah.
I think if good science or well, let's just stop with the science. Like if good research, good pursuit of truth, right? If it
Mhm.
becomes like so complicated that yeah, you need like 10 credentials to figure it out. I mean, sure, there's going to be a place for people who do theoretical physics, and I'm not in
Mhm.
that place. That is also not my place. There's always things that a certain level of expertise is required for, but what's our point in trying to understand people better? Like, what's our
Yeah,
point with social research? And if our point is understanding people better, and why, so we can understand God better, um,
exactly.
then absolutely, like gatekeeping, unnecessary complexity is to be avoided. Yeah.
One of the other things that you mentioned in the book, I want to say it's like towards the outset, but you mentioned that very few Catholic women with large families have been canonized,
Mm,
with
yeah.
Elizabeth Bailey Seton being, I think I'm saying that right,
Yeah.
being one of the exceptions.
Yeah.
Why do you think this is the case, and how do you believe the church's approach to canonization impacts perceptions of motherhood and family size?
Oh, that's a big question. You just denied being a nerd, but actually I think you are definitely like you definitely are heady. That's a big question. Um, you know, um, so I think you can understand where I'm coming from there. So
Yeah.
just to start, why would I mention that at the beginning? Um, I I think I have good reasons for writing this book and writing about people with large families.
Mhm.
But one of the reasons to write about it was not, just to get this right out there, was not that I think you're holier or better if you have
Mhm.
more children. I don't think that. Because I think that children are blessings from God.
Mhm.
And I don't think we should look at people and the blessings they receive and then size up their favor or their holiness on that
Yeah.
basis. Right? The whole scripture testifies that that is not how it works, and that
Exactly.
it's always a mistake to do that. Um, and so, uh, s- so really, it's a book about why people would want to be open to receiving God's blessings, right?
Mhm.
And why do I have to write about that? Well, I have to write about that because people aren't having as many children as they used to, and they're not having enough. Okay,
Yeah.
so then you have this elephant in the room. Everybody who picks up the book, they go like, "Well, you're just writing about." You're just trying to sort of say that unless you have a lot of kids, you're not holy or you're not good. And
Mhm.
of course, I'm like, I knew you were going to say that, but it's not what I think. So I,
Exactly.
I
Never
try
in
to
my
sort of
case there.
exactly. So, but coming back to your actual question, which is a good question,
Thank you.
um, I think the re- I so I think a couple things. I think first of all, I think the church does not view numbers of children as the kind of thing that automatically makes you holy.
Mhm.
So it's good that she doesn't, even if some Catholics maybe give that impression sometimes.
Mhm.
I think where there's it's like there's the
Yeah.
church and then there's like actual Christians, and we're always giving the church a bad name, whether we're Catholic
Mhm.
Christians or other Christians. Okay, so that's fine. So I wanted to set that aside, and I wanted to make it clear at the beginning that I don't think the church sets out having a large family as just it went out. By the way, in the same way, the church doesn't say like if you're a nun, you're necessarily holy either. Right? There's
Mhm.
like
Yeah.
most nuns are not canonized, and like yeah, lots were, but like most of them aren't. And actually, I've thought a lot about this. I've thought about like suppose I was a nun, and
Mhm.
suppose like I didn't. I didn't have like special visions of Jesus, and I didn't like levitate when I was like, I didn't have any obvious like
Yeah.
signs that I was specially blessed, right?
Mhm.
Would would I've asked myself that question, would I become resentful? Would I like look at God and be like, you didn't bless me like that? And she's over there levitating or whatever, like having
Yeah.
visions or whatever that is. But I think it's the same type of thing, right? So like the goal of marriage, I think, is to create a family. So we
Mhm.
get married, we hope for those blessings, right? And it's right and proper to hope for them, like Hannah, but we may not be blessed, and that's God's mystery, right? And we recognize that's not. And I think that would be true of religious life as well, that you might hope, if you were a
Mhm.
nun, that like Jesus would come to your chapel and have a conversation with you, like in the
Yeah.
flesh. We know that. I mean, there's some saints that believe that happened, but it's not like the normal expectation.
Yeah.
Um, and so, how does this answer your question? Okay, because there's holiness on the one hand, and
Mhm.
there's receiving blessings, and they look really different. Um,
Mhm.
they often look really different, and so actually, I think I think that, um, like anything else, canonization, I think, in the church is typically understood by a broad audience, and I think unfortunately by lots of Catholics too, as like a prize, like, or getting like the golden, yeah, the gold star on the top of your homework or whatever. But I think that rightly understood, it's not
Mhm.
that. It's supposed to be a testimony to living heroic virtue. And um, I suspect, well, so we believe deeply that
Yeah.
not all saints are canonized. So,
Mhm.
so there's like heaven is chocked full of people who didn't become canonized. So we actually see canonization as the sort of thing that, for whatever reason, we have enough information about somebody's life,
Mhm.
and we have popular devotion. Like if you died right now,
Mhm.
and all of your audience was like, she was really holy, um, and they started, asking God to be blessed through your friendship.
Mhm.
Basically, we would be like, oh, so there's popular devotion. Like all of her friends and family thought she died a holy death and lived a holy life. That whole thing, that's canonization.
Okay.
So
That makes sense.
that's but it's so normal that people would
Mhm.
view it as a special prize. So finally, to answer your question, I think in the history of the church, um, for for obvious reasons, there are more religious sisters, who we have a lot of knowledge of their life in relation to their life of faith.
Mhm.
So Elizabeth Seton had a lot of children, but then she became a nun, and she wrote a lot of spiritual letters to her her religious sisters. Now I mean her sisters in the convent,
Mhm.
some of whom were her daughters, by the way. Some of her
Oh,
daughters
wow.
became, yeah. So they're great. So
Mhm.
because for many of the religious women who wore habits, when I say religious, I mean like nuns and sisters,
Mhm.
we have a lot of their letters and their writings. And so those are the types of things you might use to evaluate holiness. Whereas in the history of the world or the history of the church,
Mhm.
fewer like married women would have been writing spiritual advice to other people. So it would just have been less easy to evaluate
Okay.
mothers with children
Mhm.
for, right. But actually, as we've come into a time when mothers with children have written more things and have been more widely educated, because there was a time when like nuns in the convent would have been more well educated, right? Because
Mhm.
that's like they were
Yeah,
teachers by training or whatever that was. So I actually
exactly.
think a large part of it is not the church's judgment that mothers with children aren't often living holy lives. I think it's been
Mhm.
more of an accident of what kinds of things they leave behind for the
Mhm.
church to evaluate, and so on and so forth. But now
That's
there's
fascinating. Mhm.
a lot of mothers that have been
Mhm.
canonized in the last, 100 years, way more than before.
Mhm.
So, yeah. So I do. Does it affect people's view of motherhood as a vocation and so on? I think it surely does. I mean, so we would be, it would be wrong to say that because the church had many women nuns and
Mhm.
sisters who were saints, that didn't affect young women's like images of what would be a good life. But I think there will be more. There are some, by the way. There are certainly some in the history of the church that are
Mhm.
really famous, like Saint Augustine, who wrote the Confessions. So his
Mhm.
mother is Saint Monica,
Oh,
and yeah, and she's a great saint and somebody that we people have a lot of devotion to her. And she's sort of famous for being the maybe the reason why Saint Augustine became Saint Augustine, because he was living a very wayward life. We know
mhm.
because he wrote the Confessions after he
Yeah.
converted, and his mother, he says it in the Confessions. I mean, she was like on her knees day in and day out praying that he would convert because she really thought he would go to hell if he
Yeah.
died before he converted. And so she prayed and really on her, just really devout. So many of the saints were mothers. But also, we should point out that another reason why some of those saints in the old days who were mothers, they didn't have large families, is because in the older days, I don't know how many children St. Monica actually had, but
Yeah.
you might have had 4 or 5, but only one lived to
Yeah.
adulthood. Yeah. So this phenomenon of having like 6 or 8 surviving children
Mhm.
is something more recent, right? And it's a blessing, right? Because we
Yes,
learned
absolutely.
how to avoid certain childhood illnesses and
Yeah.
death in childbirth, which is a thing too. But I believe many of those moms are in heaven and saints, even if they're not canonized by the church. Is that all clear, or is that just too convoluted? Yeah,
Chat, did that work for
yeah.
you? Because
Did that work for
I
you guys? There's a
I
lot
was just
there.
like so like soaked
There was
in
a lot.
like
There was a
laser
lot there.
focused into
Yeah.
that.
The main thing is that it's like anything else. I mean, I'm sure. I mean, kind of
Mhm.
maybe a bad example would be like this is true in the Catholic Church true
Mhm.
too, like people who are pastors or ministers
Mhm.
of a church, of a parish, they're not necessarily the right, like they're not necessarily holier than anybody, right?
Yeah.
It's an office or a service, right? Or in
Mhm.
some cases a vocation or a calling. It takes some spiritual maturity to recognize like it's not a prize to be the pastor or
Yeah.
the right or the like yeah. But when we expect our priests or our pastors to always be holier than we are, I think that's a mistake because the office itself doesn't confer holiness. But I think there's a human tendency to see that people who have a position or a title are like better.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I don't know.
That makes a lot of sense. In chat, one of the questions was, does being canonized mean getting launched out of a cannon? Can
Ah.
you confirm or deny?
Canonized is just the name we give to when you get called a saint officially. So we believe that there are the blessed in heaven, and they're all saints
Mhm.
in the small s sense of being a saint. Like
Mhm.
my grandmother is probably a saint, but then some people get this like official title of the church declaring them to be blessed in heaven, and that's like a capital S saint, and we call that
Okay,
canonization. Yeah.
that makes sense. Thank you, Hannah and Ashley, for the Rumble rant. We will get treats for Jazzy shortly.
Yeah.
Um, so you argue that expanding the scope for religion in people's lives could
Mhm.
improve birth rates, and I
Yeah.
can definitely see the argument for how that comes. But what practical steps could governments take to support
Mm.
religious communities without infringing on secular values? Because that's
Yeah.
a very much
Sure. Sure.
church-state balance.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah, for sure. Just to be clear, I definitely don't mean like like countries should become like official religions. No, no, I don't
Yeah.
think so at all. Um, and so no, but what I do mean is that like
Mhm.
how we treat our churches is ultimately a kind of family policy. So, I don't want to like get into a sticky subject, but I mean, from
Mhm.
my point of view, um, what did we do during COVID is we looked at churches and we said that they're not necessary.
Yeah.
Like we closed them down. We said, you can't go and meet together. You can't pray together. You could pray in your house. You could pray by
Mhm.
yourself. Right? And it's like if you were really if you're a religious person, you would realize, yeah, right. Actually, like praying by yourself isn't the goal here.
Yeah.
Like actually, our Lord says where 2 or 3 are gathered together. So we treated our churches really badly. We said that they were unessential. Um, that's like an example of what I mean. So you say like, what could governments do? Well, how
Mhm.
about for starters, like not view churches as like threats to your power? How about for starters, when anything bad happens, like a pandemic
Mhm.
or like a bad economy or anything else bad, acts of terrorism, how about the first thing you do is you ask your church leaders, like, what do you need to do your job better? Because there's no way we're getting our people through this tough time without strong churches. So that's what I mean. Not picking winners and saying, oh, this church is the state religion, but seeing the churches as like the lifeblood of a country,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Another pet peeve of mine is like, oh, well, wouldn't it be nicer if young people grew up with more exposure to religious values? Wouldn't it be nice if there were lots and lots of religious people who wanted to educate children? Oh, well, it turns out there are. But we're sitting around saying that actually, like, if you're content to be a completely secular person and leave
Mhm.
all of your religious beliefs at the door, the church, the state will redistribute the education dollars to your pocketbook and let you run a
Mhm.
school. But if you're that Methodist community over there, or that Presbyterian community, or that Jewish school over there, you can't have the dollars collected to run your school. Well, that's how we treat our churches. And
Yeah.
that, to me, that's like the main way that we are probably doing anti-family policy unwittingly,
Mhm.
right? So that's really what I
Absolutely.
mean. And those are the kinds of things I think I mean, we don't have to fix everything, but I think if we expanded more, I guess we could call it school choice or educational
Mhm.
freedom, where we would let those dollars flow to religious school communities,
Mhm.
that would go a long way, right? Because more young people would
Yes,
be
absolutely.
exposed to a life of faith and religious role models. Those religious schools run by good churches could be places that were truly like second homes for kids growing up in
Yeah.
difficult circumstances. Where again, like right now, like my kids in my religious college,
Mhm.
I can take them in a sense. I can pray with them. All that stuff is off the table. So I
Yeah.
think, yeah, I think expanding the religious footprint in education, not by the state, but by freeing up churches to do more of that,
Mhm.
and just treating our churches as the front line of defense against all the challenges of modern life, instead of treating them as if it's not even that we shut them down during the pandemic when we did that, right?
Yeah.
It's not even that. It's like they're viewed with suspicion,
Mhm.
right?
Absolutely.
I remember this. I got really angry. I mean, like, just admitting I got angry. I got angry during COVID when I remember some news broadcast where some
Mhm.
reporter had gone to a church. I don't, probably it was like Appalachia or someplace. And the reporter wanted to show how terrible people were for still wanting to go to church. And they had sought out this one church that was probably like violating the rules, and they were still
Mhm.
meeting like after dark, and the reporter had staked out this line of cars going to this church, and they put a microphone in the window of one of the women that was lined up, and they said,
Mhm.
aren't you aware there's like a deadly virus, and why are you still in line to go to church? And she said something which I thought was super beautiful and really lovely. I mean, she said, well, the blood of Jesus will protect us. And the reporter was obviously horrified.
Yeah.
Like, such an obviously like unscientific answer would be stated
Yeah.
that this is why we obviously had to. But my point is, like, we viewed churches with suspicion. Like, these are
Mhm.
like ignorant, backwards people that believe
Yeah.
in things that we can't prove with our numbers and our science. And I remember just getting pretty upset and thinking, like, this is how we treat our churches. Like, we deserve what's coming.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's what I meant. If does that clear? Of course
Yes, for sure.
I couldn't write a whole second book about it in the end of that book, but I kind of just, it was like a placeholder. So maybe
Yeah.
that'll be the next book.
There's just so much like in
Yeah.
like uh, I'm just going to admit it. I'm fully obsessed with your book. I think it's incredible. I think that everybody should check the link down below to her website and make sure they read it because
Mhm.
it's, I mean, in my humble opinion, it's one of the best books to come out this year.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Do have a couple more questions before we get to the community questions, but so
Sure.
some of your subjects link the experience of loss or significant responsibility
Mm-hmm.
during childhood to their decisions to have large families.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think this indicates about the role of early life experiences in shaping adult family choices?
I think it's huge. Um, But what I think is interesting, but so first, I think like obviously like our
Mhm,
early life experiences have a huge impact. I mean, for me, well, my parents' marriage was difficult and didn't really last. But it didn't matter. Like the new babies that came in when I was growing
mhm,
up, man, we always just loved our siblings were just good. You know, they were so good.
mhm,
So I think that the experience of our early childhoods are and it. But what I think is interesting about it is among the people I talked to, it went both ways, and I think this is a testimony to human resilience, right? Because I think I don't know, right? There's
mhm.
so much abuse and so much that it's a miracle what we can recover from, right?
Mhm.
What was
Absolutely.
interesting to me was that you had people who grew up with a lot of siblings who said, "Man, I want to have a lot of siblings.
Mhm,
I want to have a lot of children growing up." But then you saw the other type, which was like women who had like no siblings and really longed for siblings, and
mhm,
and so it's a good testimony to sort of like we don't our early life influences us, but not in a way that like monkey see, monkey do, right?
mhm,
Not in a way we just want to replicate exactly what we had, but more in the way that it kind of we are. And I think this is just a testimony to truth, right? And God's truth, like that more in a way that we encounter reality and then we are able to take it in and reflect on it and then process it and turn it into something that directs us towards good, right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. In chat, there's a couple. I'm an only child, and I think it made me want more children. So lonely. I
Mhm.
always wanted a sibling.
Yeah.
Girl, same. I feel that. I grew up an only child as well, and
Yeah.
I want to have as many as God allows me to.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we will
Yeah.
pray for that. We will be praying for that. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I heard from people who had no siblings and that made
Mhm,
them they were lonely. I heard from people who had one sibling, but it was like the other gender, like, you know,
mhm,
women I talked to had like, I just had a brother and I always wanted a
mhm.
sister. And
Yeah.
that was really powerful for me to hear those sorts of things. So I think it affects us a lot, but in an interesting way. Yeah.
Yeah. Many women in your study expressed a sense of identity and fulfillment through having large families.
Mm.
How do you think societal narratives about motherhood and career need to evolve to support these choices?
Oh man, you know, obviously, like
Yeah.
yeah, we're sort of. I mean, I feel like we booked this tonight weeks ago,
Yeah.
probably even a month or two ago. But I feel like now we're all just fresh off of this like Harrison Butker debate, like
Yes.
which was like, geez, like if we needed a reminder that like this is all a third rail.
Yeah.
I said to my husband, um, I'm, I mean, in my own way, I tried to defend Butker. I actually didn't think it was our job to defend him in the sense like he's a man and he can defend himself and
Yeah.
he didn't seem to be um you know it's fine but but man it was just like I said to my husband, I mean goodness, like it just shows you how what a third rail it is to talk
Yeah.
about kind of, I guess I'll just put it this way, like the should, right? Like you should
Hmm.
do this or you should do that. I agree with I agree with Whiskey Biz. Yeah, I didn't see anything wrong with what he said at all.
Exactly. I didn't
But the
either.
explosion of it was, I think, the phenomenon was what was really mind blowing to me. Was the phenomenon like what is like a dude loves his wife, has a couple of kids,
Yeah.
and loves his faith and talks about how good that is, and like a meltdown. So I thought like
That's literally the dream.
yeah, probably 3 months ago, I would have said, "Gee, I think we've really made a lot of progress in terms of normalizing motherhood as a choice for people." Um, but geez, like what a meltdown that was, which I thought was
Yeah.
just amazing. Um, and so yeah, so just maybe I'm just gonna hang my head and say that's a great question. I don't know what we're gonna do about it because
Yeah.
if we can't even say that we've experienced something as good without people. Now, listen, like
Hmm.
there's a piece of me that says this. Just like well, I think one of the things we've lost in modern society is the conversation in the same gender space.
Hmm.
So I think like there's a lot of manning up that probably has to happen, but it's not me that needs to call out the men. Like it's the men who have to call out the men.
Exactly.
And I think on the women's side, I think that's like there's some of this that we have to do like amongst ourselves.
Yeah.
And I would have said I thought we made a lot of progress, but maybe we haven't. So what has to happen? I mean, goodness. I, I used to say before I wrote the book, and now I guess I say like so much to it. I actually think really just talking about it more, because if it does that, then obviously like we
Yeah,
should keep saying it. We should keep saying it, right?
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, and not in a in your face or rude way, precisely for some of the reasons we talked about before.
Exactly.
We have to be, we have to hold two ideas together at the same time, right? That children are one of the greatest goods we can receive and a great blessing, but also
Hmm.
they're not objects of choice, right? And we can't
Yeah,
go get them and we can't turn them into consumer goods. And there's two ways we
exactly.
could do that, right? We could turn them into consumer goods in the way that we downgrade them and we treat them like cars or trucks or boats or so much biomatter to be disposed
Hmm.
of. That would be terrible.
Yeah.
But obviously, like like religious people could do the same thing, like, and that's where you develop like a sense of shame if you couldn't have children.
Hmm.
And it's possible to do this. This is God is the God of contradictions. Our God is the God of
Yeah.
contradictions, right? So there's no danger. Like Harrison Bucker can say this is the thing that his wife is most proud of,
Hmm.
and he believes that that's what she would say, and that is there's no contradiction between that and saying that other things can be good too, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly.
and that's so maybe if you're, I don't know. So for me, it's not a problem because I think like, like we like it's in death that we have gain, right? So like think
Hmm.
about these really basic contradictions that are deep in the heart of Christianity. And maybe,
Exactly.
I don't know, maybe living outside of Christianity, you just sort of think everything has to not contradict itself or not look like a contradiction. But our God,
Yeah.
I mean, right? It's like that.
Exactly. He's big enough to be able to hold them all.
Yeah, and our salvation is at the intersection of these two pieces of wood, right? And it's
Exactly.
like, okay, that's really deep. So, okay. So I don't know. I of course it's a sadness that somebody like, I mean, I'm like, guys, like too like all my sort of I mean, of course there's a Catholic thing, so there's a lot of
Hmm.
intra-Catholic stuff going on about this. And I just was looking
Yeah.
around like, do any of you have a 28-year-old son? I'm like, he's 28. I'm like, he's so young. Like, just get off of
Yeah.
his back for a second. Like, you know, my
Literally.
son is 24. If he was gonna write a speech, he would say all kinds of things in an awkward way, but I'd be like, bravo, go. Like, just, this is goodness gracious. So
Exactly.
yeah, I think it was a moment. It was really a moment. But I mean, my hat's off to him for keeping his composure. His coach and a lot of people defended him. And
Exactly. Even like team investors, even Jason Kelsey,
yep,
which I know
yep, that
isn't
was
particularly popular, but
no, it's good. Yeah, Mahomes.
yeah.
I think that was great. But yeah, certainly, like it does also show the power of witness, and he has a big platform, and he wasn't afraid to make a kind of statement. Yeah, so
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, I need to be just as, I mean, in my own way, I'm not an NFL player, so I could like it's just yeah. And I'll probably put things differently, but I do think, yeah, talking about it. So I, the way I sometimes put it is just telling the stories of
Hmm.
our. You could say the same about marriage, telling the stories of our churches, telling the stories of our faith communities, like,
Yeah.
and we just have to trust that this is the right path. We are going to get scandalized the minute we think that, well, we have the truth on our side, so of course it should work.
Hmm.
Like, you're like, okay, right, except that there's just a spiritual battle. So
Hmm.
um like last
Exactly.
time I heard, we were not supposed to, like, just rest and be like, oh, the victory is already won. And what I just mean is sort of to be realistic, like the reason saying the truth, like children are the greatest good,
Hmm.
the reason saying that doesn't persuade everybody is because like there there is evil. And I
Yeah.
mean, there are
Exactly.
principalities and powers, and they're not all good ones.
Exactly.
Right. So then we like show that our faith is weak. We're like, oh well, I've been arguing it all my life and no one's convinced yet. Yep, I know. Keep at it.
And that's something that we really have to balance doing, not just by words, but also by example, like you
Right.
talked about with,
Right.
your students as well.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Um, but then I think, well, what fertile ground, like what a great place to, and I've seen your voice a little bit on Twitter. I was like off Twitter mostly while I was trying to write my
Mhm.
book. So now I've just been like a fire hose trying to get back in again, just to promote the book. I don't think I have any, I'm not like a personality. I'm not like a great Twitter person. I try
You're a
to,
delight.
I try to write about
I
my kids
appreciate
a
your
lot.
humility, your humility, and you're a delight.
But the point is, um, yeah, we learning about, just in the last few months, all the other
Mhm.
Christian women out trying to, and Jewish women and women of
Mhm.
many faiths, I want to be clear,
Yeah.
who are trying to just speak the truth in charity. And you see, like, okay, we're not alone. There's a lot of us, and encouraging each other is, I
Mhm.
think, one of the most Christian things you can do is encourage, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of criticism out there,
Oh yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
much. And a lot of people seem to think virtue is like getting the criticism exactly right. Like, oh no.
No,
I mean,
that's not
of
how it
course,
works.
we must speak the truth. But yeah, for sure. So I think whatever that is, a kind of witness. And so yeah, motherhood is under attack, and I think
Yes, for sure.
it's fair to say that. And what a beautiful witness that you give, recognizing that it's not a gift you've had yet, but then your whole personality just is like maternal in such a
Thank
beautiful
you.
way. And I deeply believe that some people are called by God to give witness to to give witness to the beauty of motherhood in ways that, are in solidarity with others who are suffering. So
Mhm.
maybe, I just think God wraps these things up and uses them for his purpose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a lot of kind of maternity that goes into femininity, where we
Right.
can nurture in a whole plethora of ways that, you know, different people get different blessings.
Yes.
And
Right.
whatever those looks like, it doesn't necessarily mean that one is more blessed than the
Mm-mm.
other.
Mm-mm. That's right. And the most important blessings are the ones we can't see, right? I mean,
Exactly.
I mean, that is something we know for sure because grace is not
Yes.
visible. And so, woe to us, right? If we look at somebody who's dressed nice or has a nice car, a nice house, a big boat, we go like, oh, they're so blessed, right? No,
Hmm.
that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Now, children are material and we can see them, but they're not merely material, right? We can
Hmm.
see them. And so it's a danger to be like, oh, they're more blessed. And we don't know that it's a blessing. Every child is a blessing. And so a person might be more blessed with children, right? But
Hmm.
may not be more blessed overall. And
Exactly.
we have to keep that lively sense of that. And Jesus, of course, in his ministry, like he pushes back on that, right? Like the man born blind
Yeah,
isn't necessarily born blind because he was more sinful, right?
exactly.
And that's a mistake. So so that's okay. We have to have confidence. Like I think that although faith is, there are these like apparent contradictions. Like I think even children see this, right?
Yeah.
Like they recognize, oh, maybe the child with the disability that's in my class, like, yeah, maybe there's a weird way in which God loves that child even more, right?
Hmm.
Identifies with his weakness, or asks the child to be a testimony to like the reality of our being a new creation in Christ.
Hmm.
Like it's like,
Exactly.
and as soon as you say that, you're like, oh, wait a second. Oh, I want to be disabled too, right? Right.
And the
Right.
funny thing that
Yeah.
like what kind of reminds me of, I was supposed to go on my very first like big girl business trip. I was so stoked. It was a couple years back. I was
Yeah.
like, I finally get a business trip and it's oceanfront property. It's gonna be amazing. And I thought it was gonna be like this huge blessing. And then I ended up in the hospital because my doctor was like, you're not going on a plane
Oh
because
no.
you're gonna pass out
Oh
because
no.
of like this one particular health issue I had dealing with at the time.
Oh. Oh
And
no.
I was in the hospital where I shouldn't have like it was an unplanned me being in the hospital thing, and that's when I actually got saved.
Oh my goodness.
And I wouldn't have had that weird
Yeah.
health issue not
Yes.
interfered with
Yes.
me going to like my fancy business trip.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's so Pauline, right? This is like,
Yeah.
yeah, this is very deeply Pauline. And it's a beautiful thing. we just don't want to be sick. We don't want to be
Yes.
disabled, right? Um, but I like when I read the scriptures, I'm always like, well, actually, wouldn't it have been nice to be the man born blind? Like actually, you don't get to be in that place. Like, right? We have to recognize that we're blind.
Yeah.
But if you are blind, right? It's like
Mhm.
actually you are so much more dependent on God, and that's what we're all supposed to
Yeah.
be. So we realize like it's actually a we should be worried about totaling up like lists of
Mhm.
like huge accomplishments and that sort of thing. So yeah, so a lot to reflect on there.
Yeah. It's very much, for when I am weak, then I am powerful, like the Apostle Paul said.
Exactly. Exactly. We really resist that. And actually, I think this is one of the reasons people today in our currently not particularly Christian society, I think that's one of the
Mhm.
reasons we don't like babies around. I think they really they remind us of our weakness, and they're really weak.
Yeah.
And we don't value things that are weak. We value things that are like kind of complete and accomplished.
Yeah.
Uh, and then just, and then it's worse than that. It's like worse than that is that
Mhm.
God became a baby. Right.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Like there's like, that's a kind of like the ultimate challenge. Right. So
Exactly.
yeah. So I think
Exactly.
the less Christian a society becomes, probably the more they're at odds with babies and children. Yeah.
Yeah. And so now we have some questions from our community, which are really awesome ones.
Great.
Thank you guys for sending these in. On the app formerly known as Twitter. So, one of the questions, this one comes from Hannah, is what advice do you have for women who have been called to pursue a career path, but also
Hmm.
called to motherhood in the future?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. So